The ground was wet, and he knew that one wrong step would be his last. Théo Bassan was not the kind of man who took risks on impulse. At 38 years old, an environmental researcher with nearly a decade working in the savannas of East Africa, he had learned that nature does not forgive distraction. But that morning, when he moved forward along the slippery stretch of the Karun cliff, there was no rational calculation in what he did. There was only a roar, faint, desperate, unlike anything he had ever heard in the field. He stopped, looked down. About 4 meters below the edge of the cliff, a lioness was hanging. Her front paws clung to a narrow ledge of rock, her entire body suspended over an abyss more than 30 meters deep. She did not scream. She did not struggle. She only held on, with a strength that seemed to be fading with every second. Théo dropped his backpack on the ground. He took out the safety rope he carried for technical use. His hands trembled, but not from fear, from pure adrenaline. He tied one end to an acacia trunk, tested the knot 3 times, and went down. The wind cut through him. The stone, damp with dew, gave way once beneath his foot. He took a deep breath and continued. When he reached her level, the lioness's eyes met his. There was no aggression. There was exhaustion, a kind of surrender he would never have expected to see in a predator of that size. He slid his arms under her body. She weighed more than anything he had ever carried. But he climbed. 1 meter, then 2, then 3. His arms burned. The rope scraped his palm until it bled. At the top, he dropped the animal onto the ground and lay beside her, panting, staring at the white morning sky. The lioness stayed still for a long moment. Then she slowly stood, looked at him once more, and walked toward the brush without making a sound. Théo thought he would never see her again. He was wrong. If you're enjoying this story, subscribe to the channel, like the video, and tell me here in the comments what you think, and which city or country you're watching from. 3 weeks before that morning on the cliff, Théo had arrived in the Karun region with a specific mission. A mineral processing industry was operating less than 12 kilometers from the Asil River, the main water source for the local wildlife. The internal reports he had received anonymously pointed to the illegal disposal of chemical waste directly into the groundwater. No one had investigated because no one wanted to get on the company's bad side. It employed a large part of the population of the nearest town and had enough political connections to bury any violation. But the animals were dying, not in a spectacular way, in a silent way. Buffaloes found with no apparent cause, birds that stopped singing in certain areas of the territory, and reports from local residents about the river water having a smell that was not natural, a smell that lingered in the throat. Théo had documented all of this in the field for weeks, but he was missing the definitive proof, the kind of proof that shuts down a company and sends people to jail. It was during one of these collection expeditions that he heard the lioness's roar on the cliff. After saving her and seeing her disappear into the brush, he was shaken in a way he couldn't quite explain. It wasn't the shock of the situation. It was something else, a feeling that something had begun there, without him knowing what. He returned to the camp, cleaned the cut on his hand, ate something that tasted like nothing, and slept poorly. The next day, he resumed his work. The water samples he had collected near the southern bank of the Asil showed levels of sulfur compounds almost 4 times above the tolerable limit. He photographed, cataloged, and sent the files to his research partner, Dina Yaret, who was working on laboratory analysis 300 kilometers away. Dina's response came quickly and bluntly. "Théo, this isn't operational negligence. This is intentional." He reread the message twice. Before he could respond, he heard a noise behind the tent. Heavy, rhythmic, too close. He turned slowly. It was her. The lioness was standing less than 6 meters from the entrance of the tent, looking directly at him. No threat in her posture. No lowering of the head that precedes an attack. Just that fixed, dense gaze, as if she were evaluating something only she could see. Théo didn't move. He controlled his breathing. He knew that any sudden movement could change everything in a fraction of a second. She stayed there for almost 2 minutes. Then she turned and disappeared into the darkness. He stayed awake the rest of the night. In the morning, he told Rael, his field assistant, what had happened. A 24-year-old who had grown up in the region and knew that savanna better than any map. Rael listened without interrupting. When Théo finished, he simply said, "She didn't come see you. She came to show you something." Théo thought it was an exaggeration, but he kept the sentence in mind. 2 days later, while following a trail he didn't usually use, he found her tracks on the ground. Fresh, leading toward the northern sector of the territory, an area he had not yet fully mapped because access was difficult and the vegetation too dense. He followed the tracks. The vegetation opened into a clearing on the banks of a smaller tributary of the Asil, and there, partially hidden by branches and dried mud, there was a pipe, wide, rusted, emerging from an artificially excavated slope, and from the pipe, slowly draining, a dark liquid that flowed straight into the water. Théo stood there looking at it for a time he couldn't measure. Then he took the sampling equipment from his vest, knelt at the bank, and got to work. He collected samples of the water, of the sediment, and photographed the pipe from every possible angle, including the numerical marking on the side that identified the origin of the pipeline. When he sent the photos to Dina, she replied in less than an hour. "That serial number belongs to the industrial plant of Veconextricos. Théo, I need you to get out of there now." He didn't leave, because at that moment, less than 20 meters away, he heard something that made his blood run cold. Human voices, coming in his direction. He threw himself behind the vegetation and stayed completely still. 2 men were walking along the bank of the tributary with flashlights, even though it was broad daylight. One of them carried a radio. The other held something Théo couldn't immediately identify, but it had a long, metallic shape. They spoke in low voices, checking the pipe, looking around with far more attention than ordinary maintenance workers would. Théo breathed through his nose, slowly, without taking his eyes off them. One of the men stopped, looked directly at the vegetation where Théo was hiding, stayed like that for a few seconds, then said something to the other, and the two continued walking. Théo waited 15 minutes before moving. He returned to the camp by an alternate route, alerted Rael with a code they had agreed on for risky situations, and began organizing everything. The critical equipment was packed first. The data was copied onto 3 different devices, and one of them was hidden in a false compartment inside a box of geological samples. That same night, Dina contacted 2 investigative journalists she had worked with for years and an environmental law firm that had already brought down illegal concessions in other countries. The evidence was transmitted in encrypted form. Théo knew that from that point on, it was a matter of time. Either the evidence would reach the authorities before Vecon realized what was happening, or someone would show up at the camp before that. At dawn the next day, they showed up. 3 unmarked vehicles stopped 200 meters from the camp. Théo and Rael were no longer there, but the monitoring cameras that Rael had discreetly installed in the trees around the area captured everything, including the faces, the license plates, and the moment when one of the men broke into the main tent. That footage was what sealed the case. With the images of the break-in combined with the chemical samples and the identification of the pipe, the law firm filed an emergency action. In less than 48 hours, an environmental task force with judicial backing arrived in the region. Veconextricos had its operations suspended. 4 directors were detained. The man who had broken into the tent was identified as a private security contractor for the company, with a record of witness intimidation in another state. It was at that moment, while the agents were working in the clearing, that Théo heard a familiar sound coming from the forest. Low, hoarse, unmistakable. He turned slowly. The Lioness was at the edge of the clearing, lying in the tall grass, watching the agent's movements with a calm that seemed almost deliberate. But that wasn't what took Theo's breath away. Beside her, curled up against her body, were 3 cubs. Small, curious, stumbling over each other as they tried to stand on the uneven grass. One of them looked in Theo's direction and froze, ears raised, as if trying to understand who that man was who smelled different from everything in the savanna. Theo felt something tighten in his chest in a way he couldn't name. Rael came up behind him, saw the scene, and said nothing for a long moment. Then he spoke softly. She was pregnant when she fell from the cliff. Theo didn't respond. There was nothing to say. He stood there until she got up, gathered the cubs with a gentle movement of her muzzle, and disappeared once again among the trees. No hurry, as if she knew she was safe. In the months that followed, laboratory analyses confirmed that the levels of toxins in the tributary had begun to recede after Vecan shut down. The Asil River, which had shown critical levels of contamination for months, displayed its first signs of chemical recovery within a time frame that surprised even the most skeptical specialists. The local wildlife began to change as well. Not dramatically, not overnight, but Rael, who continued monitoring the region, reported the gradual return of species that had disappeared from that area over the past 2 years. Theo returned to the region 6 months later, at the invitation of the environmental task force that had taken over the permanent monitoring of the area. On the last afternoon before leaving again, he walked alone to the clearing. There was no one there, but on the ground, in the dry mud near the edge of the tributary, there were fresh tracks. 4 sets of footprints. 1 large, 3 small. He stood there looking at them for a while. Then he smiled, slung his backpack over his shoulder, and started walking back. Sometimes saving a life doesn't seem like a big deal in the moment, but it echoes in ways we can never predict. If this story touched you in any way, subscribe to the channel, like the video, and tell me here in the comments what you thought, and which city or country you're watching from. We read everything.